Welcome back to Module 3, Reforming Ohio. Today our subject is the Ohio Way. The Ohio Way is my term for the civilization, that is the culture, the communities, the economies, that made Ohio a creative and dynamic place circa 1900. The Ohio Way describes Ohio at its peak. Consider three facts. First, from 1868 to 1920, an Ohioan won the presidential election 9 out of 14 times. Second, world-changing technology was invented in Ohio in this period, including the airplane and the electric ignition system for automobiles. This 1910 photo shows you the inventions department at National Cash Register, a Dayton area company. What you see is, in effect, a research lab in which people tinkered and played with machines. Most of these men probably didn't have college degrees. They were most likely skilled machinists capable of pulling things apart to see how they worked and envisioning how to make them work better, or perhaps how to work completely differently. More importantly, they were gathered together, learning from one another, making each other smarter. And third, Ohioans led the world in attempts to make the world a better place for working class families, for the people who went down the mine shafts, who worked the furnace at the steel mill, the people, in other words, who did the dirty, dangerous work of building modern America. So the union movement was important to Ohio. Two important unions were founded in Columbus. In 1886, the American Federation of Labor, and in 1890, the United Mine Workers. These three facts illustrate different parts of Ohio's world circa 1900, but each of them gets back to a central idea, a common theme: social capital. At its very basic level, social capital describes the strength of social networks that connect diverse people to common goals and ideas. Phrased as a question, social capital asks, how many links do you have to people with an education, with constructive habits? To people and institutions that connect you to others and extend opportunities and convey important information to you. In this period, Ohio offered a deep well of social capital. Through reform movements, trade, and immigration, Ohio cities were designed to serve places and people outside of Ohio. And as a result, its people were accountable to one another and to the wider world. So let's explore the Ohio Way. The Ohio Way has three basic elements. The first is culture, and by culture I mean a set of ideas that shapes the norms of society. In other words, how should one behave? Important behaviors here included hard work, thrift, sobriety, and self-improvement. These traits may seem corny today, old-fashioned even, but they were touchstones for Ohioans circa 1900. They were meaningful ways to think about how to live your life. We can also see the lasting influence of William Holmes McGuffey, the teacher and writer of children's spelling books. Now, along with the set of ideas comes the inevitable comparison. Who fails these standards? Too often, middle-class, native-born Ohioans concluded that immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, and African Americans too, were incapable of demonstrating these traits, so they could never be true Ohioans. But for those people who could meet these standards, white, native-born Protestants, for example, they might need to be reformed, they might need to be helped. And so culture comes not just with a set of ideas and a comparison, it comes with an agenda as well. Should Ohioans reform these people or these societies and these organizations that fail the standard? And here, cooperation was important. The first response was always to invite cooperation, that is, to persuade that reform was necessary. So note that John D. Rockefeller, Boss Cox, and Mother Stewart all asked their targets, these people and institutions that had failed their test, to cooperate. Rockefeller in offering his inefficient competition to be bought out, Cox in cajoling Democrats who were more interested in the status quo to join him in his schemes to improve the city, or Stewart in singing hymns and praying and picketing until the saloon owner realized the error of his ways. The second element of the Ohio Way is power. Now, not everybody agreed to cooperate. In that case, Ohioans were ready to use power to compel reform. The Civil War is the best example. Harriet Beecher Stowe, for example, asked that people look into their hearts and discover that slavery was immoral. She asked, in other words, that people reform themselves. But Southern plantation owners rejected that invitation, so the use of power, the Union military, was necessary to abolish slavery. You can also see power in the actions that Rockefeller took as he made good on his promise to bury the inefficient, wasteful competitors who refused to join him. From his point of view, he merely eliminated an organization that had refused to meet a reasonable standard of behavior. And you can see it in the decades-long war that the Ohio Republicans waged against Rockefeller. He had plenty of chances to mend his bribing, bullying ways, but he refused to reform. So the use of political power was justified. And finally, you can see it in Boss Cox's blunt threat to wipe out Cincinnati Democrats. They stood in the way of the smooth function and reform of a desperate city. But can you see the use of power in Mother Stuart? She was, after all, more interested in persuading individuals to reform themselves. Her temperance movement, however, was eclipsed by the Prohibition movement, that is, a movement to compel people to stop drinking. That movement was also centered in Ohio, and it was led by the Anti-Saloon League, which was founded in Oberlin, Ohio in 1893 and relocated to Westerville, a suburb of Columbus, in 1909. This movement, unlike Stuart's movement, was led by men, and they focused their efforts on the abolition of sale of alcohol through outlets such as saloons. They named their organization the Anti-Saloon League in order to tell the American public precisely what they opposed: the political power of immigrants. Recall that often in large cities, the saloon was the politician's office, his power base in immigrant neighborhoods. The Anti-Saloon League was effective and influential, and they built off Mother Stuart's movement, but they, more than any other organization, helped to persuade America to amend the Constitution, ratifying the 18th Amendment in 1919 to outlaw the manufacture and distribution of alcohol. They used power to compel reform. The third element of the Ohio Way is global networks. And this element starts with the idea that Ohio cities were once foreign enclaves. We can see this especially when you look at the workforce in Ohio's factories. In 1910, for example, 91% of the workers in Cleveland blast furnaces and rolling mills were foreign-born, while 71% of its semi-skilled laborers were foreign-born. And in 1915, 71% of workers at the Youngstown Sheet and Tube were foreign-born. Finally, according to the U.S. Census in 1920, 69% of Cleveland's residents were either foreign-born or the child of a foreign-born parent. And in Youngstown, that number was 34.2%, and in Lorain, 37.1%. In Ohio overall, 33% of the state's residents had at least one foreign-born parent. Ohioans were connected to the world through the networks that immigration created. And they were also connected by the ideas, especially the reform movements that flew through these networks. Take, for example, Toledo, Ohio. In the 1890s, Toledo was the center of some of the most exciting experiments, not just in the state and not just in the nation, but in the world. And the catalyst for these experiments was Samuel Golden Rule Jones. Jones was born in Wales in 1846. He and his family immigrated to the United States in the mid-19th century. And then Jones left school at an early age in order to help his family survive. He eventually found his way to the oil fields in western Pennsylvania in the 1860s and the 1870s. And then in 1885, he moved to Lima to explore the oil fields there. And he established a successful company and then was, of course, bought out by John D. Rockefeller, making Jones a wealthy man. He then moved to Toledo and established a business that made machinery for oil drilling. Now, Jones ran his company in an unusual way. He insisted on the dignity and self-respect for everyone. In fact, he posted a sign in his factory that said, "The rule that governs this factory, do unto others as you would have them do unto you." The Golden Rule. Now, Jones himself followed through. He paid 50% higher wages than his competitors. He created a profit-sharing plan. He even offered paid vacations, a daycare facility, and, most radically, he maintained an 8-hour workday. Many people thought he was a radical with un-American ideas. Jones said simply that he was practicing applied Christianity. Jones ran for mayor of Toledo in 1897. He narrowly won and then was reelected 3 times. He didn't accomplish much of his agenda, but he did make Toledo the first American city with an 8-hour workday for municipal employees. And while he opposed the vice industry, he did not blame individuals for social problems that had trapped them. Corrupt institutions, governments, businesses, and churches, were more interested in greed and power than they were in the common good. These institutions had failed the Ohio test, and Jones believed that they would not reform themselves. He tried to use local power to make these institutions irrelevant. So his real goal as a politician was not to pass particular legislation, but to build a community by defeating selfishness. Not a goal that leads to much of a record, but a goal that made him part of a network of people seeking to improve the lives of ordinary people, a network that made Ohioans accountable to one another and to the wider world. The last point about global networks focuses on technology. Ohioans played a crucial role in the development of the modern world. For example, Cleveland ranked fifth in the world in terms of the importance of its inventions to the industrial world. These inventions ranged from oil refining techniques to processes to unload iron ore from ships to the electric railway. And of course, there was the Cleveland based Winton Automobile Company, the first U.S. company to sell an automobile, and in 1900, the largest producer of gasoline powered cars. And then there was Dayton. In 1900, the city of Dayton had more scientific patents per capita than any other U.S. city. Part of this has to do with location. Dayton, nestled in the Miami Valley, was rewarded by its proximity to Cincinnati. The demand for skilled labor in Cincinnati in the 1830s and the 1840s and the 1850s meant that by 1900 the Miami Valley was a global center of mechanical expertise. That these skilled laborers were clustered in this one valley meant that they could collaborate with one another and learn from one another. For example, consider the case of National Cash Register, a Dayton company. NCR hired a mechanical engineer, Edward Deeds, and Deeds recruited Charles Kettering, then a recent graduate of Ohio State University. NCR brought them together, and in fact they made millions for NCR, but they left to form their own company called the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, or DELCO. At Delco, Kettering invented the electrical ignition system for cars, which is important enough. But it's also interesting that Kettering and Deeds recruited two other local self-trained mechanical engineers, Wilbur Wright and Orville Wright, to join a club that they called the Barn Gang. The purpose of the Barn Gang was to discuss scientific and technological issues. Kettering and Deeds hoped to offer members social and educational opportunities. The club grew to some 400 members by 1990 and still runs today. And we see the presence of capital or financing as well. There were plenty of successful businesses in the Miami Valley looking to invest in the next technological improvement. And it's important that these were local investors looking for local ideas. So here's what's happening in Dayton around 1900. There's a region full of mechanical experts, often people trained in apprenticeships rather than in universities. And we see businesses recruiting more skilled labor into the region. And when large numbers of skilled people gather together in a given space, they collaborate, they trade ideas, they help each other with projects. Another way to say this is that Dayton and the Miami Valley made people smarter. The region offered an individual the chance to develop his human capital or individual skills, and it offered financial investments to develop these ideas by skilled labor in the region. So Dayton in 1900 served the purpose of cities. Cities should spur innovation by facilitating face-to-face interaction. They attract talent and sharpen it through competition. They encourage entrepreneurship, and they allow for social and economic mobility. Of course, what we're really talking about here is social capital. The more links you have to other individuals, and the more human capital these individuals have, the greater the social capital of a particular place. And Dayton had plenty of social capital, so much so that we can call the Miami Valley circa 1900 the Silicon Valley for mechanical engineering. And what happened to Dayton in 1900 happened to other Ohio cities as well. In fact, the culture of the Ohio Way, its global networks, its willingness to be accountable to one another and the wider world, helped to create a deep well of social capital in Ohio.